As I mentioned in my previous video about J.K. Rowling's transphobic rhetoric and why she's wrong, I grew up with Harry Potter. I also mentioned that I grew up in an emotionally abusive home. This wasn't something I ever intended to talk about online, but once I had brought it up, I felt that cutting it out would be disingenuous and antithetical to my points, which were that forcing the world to account for your trauma is narcissistic and stupid. I was upset that something that had helped me through my terrible childhood was tainted by the wand of turfery, and in the past week I've spent a lot of time thinking about whether or not I'm still allowed to like the books. This isn't a Death of the Author video. There are plenty of those out there, and also a fantastic one by Sarah Z where she talks about authorial intent, as well as a new one where she asks if it's still possible to love Harry Potter despite Joanne's bullshit. And this is sort of my response to the second one. This is a video about coming to terms with emotional abuse, featuring the Harry Potter series. Let me explain. Emotional abuse is complicated. The person abusing you is in some position of power over you, whether that be a boss, a parent, a partner. They use this power to manipulate you into feeling like your own will, your feelings, your whole being is worthless. The biggest misconception is that this is achieved by simply being mean to you every day. Just like a depressed person isn't constantly in a catatonic state, emotional abusers aren't constantly punching down every second of every day. Gaslighting and manipulation are a huge part of what makes it so hard to break the cycle. If someone you didn't know very well came up to you and punched you or insulted you, odds are that you would decide you don't want anything to do with that person. But if that same person came up to you, bought you dinner, made you feel special, and then hit you, or undercut your self-worth, then you would think twice about just walking away. Especially if the second they see you upset, they apologize for their actions, usually by crying or promising you it'll never happen again. This is what makes it so hard for people to walk away from abusive situations. It's not the lows, it's the highs. I'm not going to go into my whole childhood because I don't feel the need to put that all out there for the entire internet to see, but my father is not a good person. My parents got divorced when I was 6, and my time was split 60-40 in favour of my mum. Multiple times during these earlier years, I would call my mum in hysterics because of Dad's temper. But once I realised that only made things worse, those calls became a lot less frequent. At some point, my father sprung the idea on me that mine and my sister's time should be spread more evenly, that it wasn't fair he only got us 2.5 days of the week, that he should have more time. And because he proposed this on a good day, and because I was a child, and because he'd been emotionally abusing me for years, I realised he was right. Of course we should be spending more time with him. So our weeks ended up getting divided exactly in half. Saturday night through Wednesday morning with Mum, Wednesday night through Saturday afternoon with Dad. And if anyone was thinking that the abuse would lessen when given an extra 24 hours with the man every week, you'd be wrong! This same manipulation technique was used years later when I was picking high schools and ended up attending the one he worked at. Now don't get me wrong, I loved that school, I loved the friends I made there and the memories, but that doesn't change that he was suddenly a lot more present in my life than he had been since before I was 6. And as I said, it wasn't all bad. Some of it was amazing. Before I was even old enough to speak, my dad used to read to me. Bedtime stories were always daddy-daughter time, and from my earliest memories, the Harry Potter books were entrenched in that. I remember every new book coming out, how excited we'd both get, how he'd read 2 chapters and then cave immediately when I begged for a third. I remember finally getting old enough to see the films in theatres. Some of my fondest memories with my father are pop culture related, and I think all of that stems from Harry Potter. My mum, who is a wonderful parent who only ever does the best she can for us, was never into pop culture. She reads a lot, but she never liked movies or TV shows, and in fact during my high school years was adamantly against it to the point where the few truly awful fights we had were about my insistence that TV was my lifeline, and she just didn't get it. And of course she didn't, because how could she? At the time, even I didn't fully understand why I clung to these things so hard, why sometimes it felt like they were my only reason to breathe. TV, movies, comics, they were the safe zone at Dad's house. Anytime a new DC show or Marvel movie or drama or comedy came out, odds are my dad and I would love it equal amounts. We would carve out the time slot for it every week, and for 40 minutes a night or 2 hours on a Friday, I could take a deep breath and know that there was nothing to be afraid of. It was escapism within the world of the media, but also outside of it too. I've always wanted to be a writer, since before I could physically write, but once I hit adolescence, I decided I also wanted to write for TV, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that TV, with absolutely no hyperbole, saved my life. Sometimes the only thing that kept me going was the thought that I'd never see the finale of Doctor Who or read the last book in a series. And now that I don't talk to my father anymore, my relationship with a lot of these things has become somewhat rocky. Some things, like the music we listen to and the shows we watch together, are so connected to my memories of him that it will probably take me years to get over. And some things I could attach to my sister or my mum or my friends, or just remove the attachment altogether and still find a way to enjoy them without being tainted.
I'm still alive.
Which is where Harry Potter comes in. For me, despite the very origins of it being something so completely entrenched in my relationship with my father, Harry Potter managed to be something else. It was escapism. I could close my eyes and pray for my Hogwarts letter and imagine that things would be okay. After the series ended, I reread them on my own upwards of 50 times, and that feels like an exaggeration, but I don't think it is. And somehow they became more than just a thing me and my father shared. They became the thing protecting me from his dark side. To use a Harry Potter-based analogy, I was living with the Dursleys, and the books were the Weasleys in their blue Ford coming to pry the bars off the windows. So for a while, they kept me going. They became part of the fabric of my personality, as they did for a lot of kids growing up in the late 90s and early 2000s. Up until less than a year ago, I was still considering a golden snitch tattoo as my first tattoo. Feel free to leave your comments about how I'm a basic nerd bitch below, we've been new. But it was deeply personal to me. And then, J.K. Rowling outed herself as a transphobe, and then used a time that she was assaulted by a man to justify her hatred of trans women. Which is especially bizarre, because even if she had been assaulted by a trans woman, that wouldn't grant her the right to generalise that every trans person is somehow evil, which means it's doubly bad to voice the anger on trans women who, just to be clear here, aren't fucking men. And suddenly, my relationship with Harry Potter became tainted in a way even my father hadn't managed to do. And I realised that in the same way I had let a lot of things go once I stepped away from my father, I would need to do the same with this series. My first thought was to write it off entirely, but that didn't seem healthy. If I wrote off every single thing that I loved in conjunction with my father, I would lose 80% of the things that make me who I am today, including this series, and that would be like taking a cloth to a whiteboard of equations and removing everything except the answer. Sure, we've still got the answer, but without the context of how we got there, we're just looking at some numbers on a blank space.
Waiting around. And it's September, so I'm skipping this town.
So what am I supposed to do? You can't unread a book series. You can't unremember the happy memories it gave you. Just like I can't erase the happy memories with my dad. And why would I want to? Sure, that would be easier, but it would also be empty. In this case, Harry Potter is the happy memory and Joanne is the person behind it. We don't have to swear off any happiness we got from the things she gave us just because it came from her. I don't have to repress all the happy memories with my dad watching sci-fi just because it came from him. Does that mean I am endorsing Joanne's comments? Absolutely fucking not. Please see my last video for reference. Does this mean I'm ever going to let my father back into my life again? No! But I can acknowledge that his influence wasn't always bad, and in fact influenced a lot of my favourite things about myself without attributing those feelings of self-worth to him. You know, because they don't belong to him. As a short aside, my father has a weird hang-up about claiming the things he introduced people to. If he was the first person to recommend you a book or a musician or a movie that you ended up loving, he lauded that over you as some kind of personal achievement that had very little to do with your own enjoyment of the thing and more to do with how great he was for showing it to you. Like he was somehow better than other people simply by virtue of introducing you to comics. Unlike J.K. Rowling, he didn't create the things he took ownership of, he just happened to experience it before you. Whoop-de-doo. So, clearly, there's a logical disconnect between my father and the things I love that I associate with him, which is obviously harder to do with Joanne because she did create the thing. But while she can still claim kudos for the creation of the thing, we can still objectively remove the thing from everything that has happened since. In particular, the bullshit retconning of the world of Harry Potter and the transphobic beliefs she holds. Most people are some swirl of good and bad things, and for the most part, that's completely okay. There's not a single person out there that's perfect, and to claim that there are is false and dangerous, and I have a whole other video in me about the dangers of stan culture and celebrity, but I digress. There are many people out there who either do not know what my father was like behind the scenes, or do know, but feel they can overlook it because it doesn't affect them, or they believe his good qualities outweigh that. Likewise, there are many thousands of people out there who feel the same about J.K. Rowling and decide for themselves that her transphobia is not a deal breaker. Unfortunately, we don't have any control over that. I could message every single person that still associates with my father to tell them exactly who my dad is as a person, but that would be a lot of time and effort for something that in all likelihood wouldn't even work. Just as you could spend a lot of your time arguing with people still supporting Joanne on Twitter and never get anywhere, it's a lot of emotional labour for very little payoff. J.K. Rowling is insanely rich, and she still has fans, but a large portion of the population know better, and we have to hold on to that. Your approach to the situation is the only one you have control over. The feelings you have about her creation are not hers and can be disconnected from her, just as the feelings I have about my dad introducing me to something can be disconnected from him. Your love of Harry Potter does not belong to J.K. Rowling. The copyright might, but your feelings do not. There are a lot of people out there who have created this idea that in order to enjoy Harry Potter, we have to completely separate it from J.K. Rowling. Full death of the author, like Hatsune Miku wrote it. I understand that perspective, and if that's how some people need to process it, then I'm not going to tell them not to. But for me, in this large extended analogy I've created, the people that are doing that are kind of like my relatives who sometimes encourage me to talk to my dad again. It comes from a really positive place, a place of love, where they don't want you to view all of the good things as part of the bad thing, and they're trying to fix something that they see as broken. But ultimately, both in my life and this analogy, I think it ends up being more harmful because there are parts of the books that do perpetuate racial stereotypes, that can be perceived as anti-Semitic. There are massive flaws in the series, just as there were massive flaws in my father, and you can't separate those from the rest of it. You can't just decide that the race of money goblins or the creatures that enjoy indentured slavery don't exist. I can't decide that my dad's bad qualities don't exist just because his good ones do, just because I loved him so much. It's well-meaning, but it's flawed, and ultimately it's not gonna fix the issue.
Hey, it's no mystery, there's nothing here for me now.
I don't think that we should be spending all of our time trying to justify why Harry Potter is totally untouchable despite J.K. Rowling's bad beliefs, because I think that's ultimately an insufficient way to address the problems in the series or its author. You can't just say, she didn't write it, ooh, it's faultless. That doesn't work. But equally, I don't think we should all turn into those vehemently anti-Harry Potter people who all came out of the woodwork the second J.K. Rowling Scooby-Doo revealed herself to be a transphobe, to be like, oh my god, we've been proven right, all this time you should never have been standing Harry Potter, like, fuck you and your interests, I guess. Because that's an equally toxic way to live your life. I'm talking about those people who hate it so much it's in their bio. People who hate it so much they're part of an online message board of people who also hate it. That means that one of your primary personality traits, instead of being someone who loves a children's book franchise, is being someone who hates it. Regardless of whether it's Harry Potter or whatever else, you've made it a defining personality trait of yours that you hate a thing. And I think that's an equally, if not much more, negative issue. There has to be a middle ground between the two, or we're just never going to be able to consume media again. That's how media consumption works. Nothing is faultless, and everything comes from somewhere. And burning the books, which, by the way, is something I'm fundamentally against regardless of politics, isn't going to do shit, because as she has taken delight over the years in pointing out, she already earned her money from that sale. You're essentially taking a lighter to your own cash. Blocking her on Twitter is harmless, and so are a number of other things, like refusing to read any new books she puts out, continuing to campaign for trans lives and awareness of trans issues, see below for links to charities and information, and just generally paying her no mind. But that is also the hardest option because it somehow feels like you're not doing enough. You get stuck in this endless cycle of wondering whether disavowing her is ever going to be enough, if you're allowed to do that while still loving the series, and whether even cutting the series out of your life will make you feel better. That cycle is a tiny hint of what it feels like to walk away from an emotionally abusive relationship.
It's all that I love and it's all that I need at Hogwarts.
A concept I've never been able to wrap my brain around is forgiveness. I went to a Christian high school, and that's something they lean on pretty heavily there. But forgiveness isn't something you can just force. It's like faith. It's there, or it's not. You don't just decide to forgive someone, and maybe this will change, but at the moment I'm of the belief that you don't need to forgive someone in order to move on from them. I haven't forgiven my father, and yet I'm living my life without him. I realized a couple of years ago that part of my aversion to forcing forgiveness is that forgiveness is such an intrinsic part of emotional abuse. Your abuser hurts you, and then they apologize, and you forgive them, because of course you do, because they love you, and you love them. You forgive them over and over and over until one day there reaches a point where they do something you can't forgive them for. Whether that's an escalation in behavior or whether you just reach breaking point, you finally take a stand. But there's a reason that statistics for people who go back to their abusers isn't 0. Even after 1 of these stands or 10 of these stands, doubt creeps in, and you forgive them again because they're not all bad. Remember when they took care of you when you were sick, or when they bought you a mug with the TARDIS on it because they know it's your favourite show? For me, forgiveness is not some wholesome Christian thing. It's a dangerous concept that kept me inside someone else's violence for 17 years. So in order to move on from Harry Potter, I don't think we can just pretend it doesn't exist, and I don't think we can just forgive all its or Joanne's flaws in order to pretend it's perfect, because it isn't. Death of the author is well and good, but when the books reflect some of Joanne's personal beliefs that profoundly, it's important to know where those events or characters came from and why it's bad. So here's my takeaway. You don't have to let Joanne's beliefs affect your own feelings on the series. She can't retroactively go back and tarnish how it affected you growing up, how it made you feel like you belonged no matter who you were, regardless of how hard she's trying. That's something that only you can decide. Is this the breaking point? Are you going to let her damaging, dangerous opinions change the way you view a series that helped you come to terms with your identity or acted as an escape during a period of time when you were stuck? Are those opinions so entrenched in the series that you can't bear to look at them anymore, or is it enough to just hold on to the parts of the books you enjoy? Like walking away from an abusive relationship, it's not a question with a single right answer. It's an emotional process, one that could take a long time and will probably involve some swaying back and forth. Nearly 3 years on from cutting off my father, I still have days where I wonder if it was really that bad, if I can still listen to those songs we used to sing in the car, and other days where a single chorus or a scene from a movie is enough to give me a panic attack. But tonight, I'm going to sit down and watch the Harry Potter movies. Partly because I already own them and burning plastic smells bad. But despite the inherent attachment these films have to my relationship with my father, I am going to enjoy them, because somehow in all this mess I've managed to separate them from him. I hope that one day I'll be able to do that with everything. And I hope that J.K. Rowling's habit of ritualistically shitting on one of the most marginalised groups in our society can be separated from the books that in many cases helped kids in that group come to terms with who they are. Like Harry Potter living in the cupboard under the stairs, the Dursleys can only hurt you for so long. Someday you can kick down that door and move on, whether you take the magic of Hogwarts with you or not.